Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Plastic Recycling Podcast. We have a special guest today, Resa Dimino. Resa is the managing partner of Signal Fire Group, a subsidiary of Resource Recycling Systems, and focused on supporting governments and businesses to navigate the development, implementation, implications of policy, regulation on sustainable materials. She's been involved in recycling from way before when it was sexy. And welcome, Risa.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Risa, today we'll be chatting a lot about EPR and the role, of course, of producers in the packaging that they use in their products. So walk us through, what is EPR exactly?
Extended producer responsibility is essentially a policy approach that requires that the producer of a product or package takes responsibility for that product or package at the end of its useful life. And that responsibility can be financial, it can be operational. It's often some combination of those two. So there's a lot of different ways EPR can play out in terms of that spectrum of operational and financial responsibility. But it's essentially the idea that producers are engaged in and responsible for managing their products and packaging at the end of its useful life. And it's important to remember when we talk about producer and extended producer responsibility, when we're talking about packaging, we really mean the brand. The producer is the person who's choosing what kind of packaging the product goes into. So it's not the company that manufactures the cereal box, it's the company whose brand is on the cereal box.
For example, converters of plastic film would not necessarily have to take responsibility for what they produce, but the grocery store, for example, that uses a plastic bag would be the one taking responsibility. Now,
Like,
the next question I have is, how is this tracked? Like, if I'm a grocery store or if I'm a brand that's producing shampoo bottles, who tracks this and how does that portion of it work?
typically, they are required to join a producer responsibility organization. And so this organization kind of sits at the center of the program and manages the obligation of multiple producers. So all of those different brands join into a producer responsibility organization, and that organization interacts with the different recycling programs on their behalf. And basically, the brand or the producer reports to the producer responsibility organization on how much material they use in the state or in the province where the program is in place. And then they pay fees to that organization to cover the cost of their material. So based on how much they sell into the market. And so, you might think, oh, well, they have lots of, incentive to cheat or underreport or things like that. But you have to think about all of the producers are in the organization. And so it's a little bit self-regulating because the companies would pressure each other to be sure that what they're reporting is fair and accurate so that one company isn't covering the costs of another. So there's a little bit of that sort of self-regulation happening among the companies within that organization. And that organization's responsibility is really to make sure that the program is implemented and that the participation is fair. So they really do a lot of work to make sure they identify all of the brands, make sure that the brands are reporting appropriately, and that they're paying the fees that they're responsible for.
So that organization is also responsible for ensuring that nobody's incentivized to misreport the numbers as well, right? So there's this
Yep,
two-step play, other members as well as the organization, playing together to ensure that these numbers are accurate. Now, what
exactly.
does that organization do with the money that they receive?
So their main objective is to meet the obligations of the law they're working under, right? So in most
Mm.
instances, that means that they enter into contracts or provide reimbursement to people who provide recycling services. So If the recycling service in your area is provided by a municipality, typically the producer responsibility organization will reimburse the municipality for the cost of providing that recycling program and including improvements. So let's remember that the reason we do EPR is to get better recycling. So we're not just trying to shift the cost from municipalities, taxpayers, ratepayers to producers. We also want things to be better. We want the system to work better. We want to recycle more. We want it higher quality and that sort of thing. So there should be improvements that come along with this. And those improvements are paid for by the producer responsibility, again, either through a reimbursement or through a direct contract. So where I live,
Mhm.
I have municipal service for my recycling here, but 3 houses down, they have to contract for their service because they're outside of the village. And so in that instance, the producer responsibility organization might enter into a contract with a private service provider to provide the recycling services for those households and then reimburse my municipality for the service that I get.
Mm,
Does that make
mm.
sense?
That makes sense. That makes sense. So I think the big takeaways for me on this was improvements because of course we see recycling rates to be still really, really low in the US.
Yep.
And maybe talk us through why is that? And then how does EPR move the needle on that? Because that's obviously a huge concern. That really creates the perception that recycling doesn't work, right? When you hear these types of news articles and say, oh, 10% of plastics were recycled last year, or 20% or 30%. Walk us through that portion because it seems to me that's where the needle starts to move.
Right. So there's 2 things that we need to have good recycling service. One is we need access. We need everybody to have a bin or an ability to bring their recyclables somewhere. And still in the United States, only about half of our households have automatic access to curbside recycling. So we have a long way to go to improve recycling. And then we have places like multifamily buildings, that often don't have easy or readily available recycling services and that sort of thing. So we can improve access by providing services to places that don't have regular recycling service now. And the standard that I like to advocate for is it should be as easy to recycle as it is to throw away your trash. So if you live in a rural area where everybody goes to the transfer station to drop off their garbage and you don't have a garbage hauler coming to your house, then it's fine to have drop off recycling because it's the same, requiring the same level of effort from you than you would have for your trash. But if you have curbside trash and you're being required to drop off your recycling, that's not equitable and that's not going to get us the best
Mhm.
participation. So access is a big piece of the pie. And then the other piece is just more better recycling, right? We want to collect as much material as possible that can be then sorted and sold to markets. And the situation we have right now is we have a really disjointed recycling system where we have municipalities who are often small and isolated and making these decisions, driving a lot of the recycling decision making around what services will be provided, what's going to be collected, and that sort of thing. They are heavily influenced by their hauler and their recycling facility operator. And then that recycling facility operator sells materials off to market, but that recycling facility operator is really getting paid in current markets. They're really making their money off of a processing fee that their customer is paying them, whether it's a ratepayer or a municipality. So they're not necessarily incentivized to maximize recycling and get the most material out of it. And often when there's a provider that provides waste services and recycling services, it might be more profitable for them to provide waste services. So they're not really incentivized to improve your recycling services. And even for municipalities that really want to do the right thing, there are areas where you only have one MRF operator. And so if that recycling facility operator doesn't want to sort additional material you want to recycle or can't because they're space constrained, capital limited, or whatever, you can't improve. And so what EPR does is it creates a broader system with sort of a central organizing principle, right? You have somebody looking at the system for the entire state and saying, okay, we want to collect the same materials statewide. We want all of our facilities to be up to snuff to collect and sort these materials and get them off to market. And we now have an entity that can pay for that and can organize that. So the producer responsibility organization sets out a plan, a program plan that says, okay, here's what we want to collect. Here's how we're going to sort it. Here's the market it's going to go to. Here's how we're going to make that happen by contracting with these folks and investing in these programs and that sort of thing. And so you bring the whole system up as in one sort of organized way. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. So let's segue into this portion where you touched a little bit about states. And let's move into the legislation because it seems like there's two pieces to move the needle. One is legislation, which is government mandated. The other is producers coming together and self regulating, right? Self
Mhm.
regulation versus government regulation. And it seems like sometimes one has to go before the other to move the needle. Sometimes producers will take responsibility and then there's no need for the government to intervene. How is this being implemented nationwide? What does it look like right now? And then my follow up question is, has EPR legislation actually moved the needle on recycling rates or not? Is it too early to tell? What does that look like?
In terms of voluntary versus mandatory, I think what we've seen on packaging in the United States is we've seen substantial investments on a voluntary basis. For example, my company RRS works with the Carton Council. They have worked diligently for over a decade, facility to facility, community to community, getting people to store cartons and aseptic packaging for market. Just got to that 60% access rate, which is excellent. That's national recyclability levels. We do similar work with organizations like the Food Service Packaging Institute, looking at segregating cups and containers for recycling and that sort of thing. It is painstaking. It is difficult. You've seen even bigger efforts and broader efforts through things like the Recycling Partnership and Closed Loop Partners. And these organizations do tremendous work, but the recycling rate as a whole is not increasing because we can't get that systemic approach and that systemic solution without having a mandatory system that everybody has to play in. Voluntary can only get you so far. And so what we've seen in a lot of different types of products historically is that a few progressive companies will get together and create an organization to do a voluntary thing and start take back. We had this with electronics in the early 2000s where companies like Dell and HP were like, okay, we'll take back your electronics. We'll set up recycling programs. We'll do events and that sort of thing. And then they realized, hey, we are actually shouldering the financial burden for an entire industry. This isn't fair. And so we actually want EPR legislation to level the playing field because everybody should have to do what we do, right? So
Sure.
that's the premise. And I think we've definitely seen substantial increases in recycling rates for packaging where EPR exists in Canada and Europe and the rest of the industrialized world. We did a study for the state of Oregon in the work that led up to Oregon passing its EPR program. And we looked at it's difficult to study this because not everybody has data from before programs. So it's hard to do the before and after. But we found a handful of places in Europe and Canada that had comparable data on packaging recycling rates before and after EPR implementation. And in every instance, there was an increase. In most instances, that increase was substantial, like doubling recycling rate. So there's no question it works if it's done well. And again, we have to look at the programs and make sure they're designed not just to shift costs, but also to have those improvements that we talked about.
So, in summary, EPR, the mandatory portion is necessary and it is moving the needle in terms of recycling rates. Talk to
Yeah.
us about where EPR has been enacted nationally. What does that landscape look like? Is it a lot of states, very few states? What does it look like over the next few years? And how do we start to get these recycling rates up?
Yeah. So you're talking about packaging specifically now because we do
Absolutely.
have a lot of EPR laws for other products. I mentioned
Yeah.
electronics, batteries, mattresses, carpets, paint. There's a ton of other products that have EPR policy, but there are 4 states that currently have EPR for packaging, and in most cases, packaging and paper products. Those are Maine, Oregon, Colorado, and California. Those
Mm.
programs are just getting started and just being organized now. All of those states are in various stages of implementing regulation, preparing needs assessments, doing program plans, and otherwise gearing up for actual producer funding. And in most cases, that funding is going to come into play. I think the earliest is Oregon mid next year, but
Yeah.
basically mid 2025 through 2027 is when we're going to see the actual funding flow and program improvements and things like that happening. So there's a lead time for sure, which is part of the urgency of like, let's get going here because it
Yeah.
takes a while.
It
You have to do
does.
all this planning, all this research, all this work. There are states considering EPR legislation. A number have considered this year. Washington State got very close, ran out of time in a short session. Minnesota is actively debating legislation right now, may pass in the next few weeks. New York is still debating its legislation. Looks like Tennessee is going to establish a study committee to work on this over the next year. So there's a lot of activity out there, and I would expect that to continue. We'll see if Minnesota passes or New York this year. We also have states like Maryland and Illinois passed laws requiring needs assessments. So they're right now getting into the process of assessing their needs, with the idea being the next step would be an EPR program coming into play. We're on that road. I can't predict what's going to happen legislatively. I wish I had a crystal ball. It would help us all plan better. But I think we are going to continue to see this kind of activity because, in addition to municipalities just being socked with recycling costs, the costs are just substantial and really not getting better. So you have that dynamic, and you also have producers and brands who want to use recycled content to meet their climate goals, to meet their sustainability goals, and things like that. And the system we have right now can't deliver what they need. And so we do have sort of pressure on both sides. Municipalities need relief, brands need this material. So it does seem like we're in a good position to get folks to move things forward. I think the key is going to be whether we can work together to find solutions that the various stakeholders that are engaged can all agree to.
We're talking about a handful of states still, right? That are moving along the EPR route. What do you feel has to happen for tipping point or a majority of states to start moving in that direction? Is that realistic? Is it not? Is it just them watching and waiting for some of these programs to actually come into play and then that starts to move? How does that work?
Well, it's interesting if you see what has progressed in Canada. I think that might be a little bit of a view into our future. In the mid 90s, the Canadian provinces started to enact EPR programs, and they started off as predominantly as cost sharing and that sort of thing. Over time, they've grown into full producer responsibility. And now I think by the end of next year, every province in Canada will have EPR programs in place. And a large part of that is because the brands and the producers, through their producer responsibility organizations, have stepped up and said, we understand that we need to take this responsibility. And if we're going to do it, let's do it in a way that works best. And so they've really engaged in a positive way and in a constructive way. And that's really helped move things forward. So am hopeful that in the US, as we see programs come into effect and they are effective, and the brands and other stakeholders see the benefit of them, that there'll be a broader consensus. And in states, if you look at recycling policy history in the US, it's been really focused on the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Upper Midwest. That's where the policy has been. And so I think that's going to be the first round of things. As we've said, Washington, Oregon, California, Minnesota, Illinois, New York, Maryland. But moving forward, if the industry folks really are able to embrace this in the way they have in Canada, then we might see states that typically don't get into the recycling policy realm really embracing this idea as a sort of a business friendly approach to solving a materials problem, a cost problem, a climate problem.
Okay, let's take out the crystal ball. Where do you see this moving in the next 5, 10 years? And EPR is one portion of the solution of increasing recycling rates. Just if we as a country in a continent try to move the needle further, where do you see things in 10 years?
Um, well, I'd like to say that we have a good handful of states that have strong EPR policies in place. We have improved recycling. We have a recycling rate that's moving. Our recycling rate hasn't budged in decades. And so we have that improvement. We have less material going to landfill, fewer greenhouse gases emitted from landfills and waste related. So I'd like to say that I can't predict a number of states, but I think we're going to continue to see every year multiple states debating this legislation and moving forward a bit at a time for sure.
Definitely exciting time for the recycling industry.
Indeed.
Um, I think EPR is definitely a huge part of the solution and something that we need, something that we need to be able to hit all the goals that you mentioned before. Any parting thoughts, Lisa, before we close off today's podcast?
The last thing I'd like to mention is it's really important as we look at policy that all of us who have a stake engage, but understand that in the policy arena, you never get 100% of what you want. Policy is messy and it's confusing sometimes and it's difficult, but it's necessary. So we all need to kind of get in the arena and figure out what the path forward is. And that's going to require compromise. It's going to require hard work. It's going to require getting messy, but that's how we get the big gains in the end.
Agreed. Agreed. Reset, can you tell us where else can we find you? I know you mentioned that you were going to be at a few conferences. Tell us where can our audience find you if they want to reach out to you?
Sure. I have the best email in the industry.
Mm.
It's
You do.
resa@recycle.com, RESA at recycle.com. And you can see the RS website is recycle.com and the signalfiregroup.com as well. I'm on LinkedIn and on Facebook as individually, and then also RS and the Signal Fire group. So for those of you who are in New York, I'll be at the New York State Federation conference in May and making the rounds around the country, talking and working with folks. So very much looking forward to seeing folks on the road.
That's lovely. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you for shedding some more light on EPR. And we look forward to having you back in the future.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Miss.